He had written her 31 letters. 31 letters full of promises about a quiet valley, a solid cabin, a good life waiting for the right woman. He described sunrises over the mountains. He described a homestead that needed a woman's hand. He described everything, except the 7 children sleeping inside. When Clara Whitfield stepped off the stage at Rawlins, Wyoming, in the spring of 1876, she was holding those letters tied with a piece of ribbon. She had read them so many times the paper had softened at the folds. She believed every word. She had sold her sewing machine, packed 2 trunks, and traveled 9 days across the country on the strength of a man's handwriting. And now she was standing in front of a cabin door, knocking, and a 16-year-old boy was opening it with a baby balanced on his hip, staring at her like she was the last person on earth he expected to see. If this happened to you, if you had given up everything and traveled 9 days only to discover the man you came to marry had lied to you from the first word, what would you do? Would you stay? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if they make you feel something real, please subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that doorway, because what happened next changed everything. The boy's name was Caleb Voss. He was 16 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had already lived twice that. He did not say hello. He did not ask her name. He looked at the 2 trunks sitting in the mud behind her, looked at the ribbon-tied letters she was still holding in her left hand, and his jaw tightened in a way that Clara would come to recognize over the following weeks. That particular tightening that meant he was deciding how much trouble something was going to be. "You're the woman from Cincinnati," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Whitfield. Is your father here?" Caleb shifted the baby to his other hip. The baby was perhaps 10 months old, round-cheeked and drooping with sleep, entirely unbothered by the cold spring wind cutting across the porch. "He's not back yet." Clara waited for more. None came. "When is he expected?" "Don't know." Caleb glanced past her toward the road, as if measuring the distance between her and wherever she'd come from. "Could be another week. Could be 2. The past was bad this year." Clara stood there for a moment with the wind pulling at her coat and the mud drying on her boots, doing the arithmetic of what he'd just told her. A week, possibly 2. She had $14 left in her pocket. The stage back east did not run again for 8 days, and she had nowhere to stay in Rawlins. No money for a hotel, no one who knew her name. She looked past Caleb into the cabin. The light inside was low. She could make out shapes, smaller shapes, standing back in the dimness, watching. "How many of you are there?" she asked. Caleb's jaw did that thing again. 7. 7. She would think about that number later, lying awake in the narrow cot Caleb had grudgingly set up near the stove. She would think about how Elias Voss had written her 31 letters, and had never once, not in passing, not even as a footnote, mentioned 7 children. She would think about how careful that omission must have been, how deliberate, how a man who could write so warmly about the color of a Wyoming sunrise had somehow found no room in 31 letters for the fact that he had a baby who still needed rocking at 2 in the morning. But that was later. Right now, standing on the porch with the wind in her face and 7 children somewhere in that dim interior, Clara made a decision. She picked up her smaller trunk. "Would you mind taking the other one?" she said to Caleb. He stared at her. "You're staying?" "I don't have much choice at the moment," she said, "and neither do you, so we might as well make the best of it." Caleb did not move for a long moment. Then, without a word, he handed the baby to someone behind him. Clara caught a glimpse of a small girl's hands reaching up, and stepped off the porch to pick up her trunk. The inside of the cabin was not what she had imagined from Elias's letters. He had described it as solid. He had used the word comfortable more than once. What Clara walked into was a structure that was technically standing, which was perhaps the most generous thing she could say about it. The roof had been patched in 3 places with boards that didn't quite match. The floor had a list toward the east wall that you didn't notice until you'd set something down and watched it roll. The stove was serviceable, but the pipe had been sealed with what appeared to be a combination of clay and wishful thinking. But it was the children who took all her attention. There were 6 of them visible in the main room. The baby had been returned to a wooden crib near the stove. and they were arranged around the space in the particular stillness of children who have learned that stillness is safer than noise. They were watching her the way wild things watch something new entering their territory. Not with hostility, exactly, but with a careful, patient assessment. The twins were easiest to identify. Lydia and Leah, 8 years old, were standing shoulder to shoulder near the table with their arms folded in identical postures, their expressions a matching study in skepticism. Claire would learn later that this was their default setting around any adult they hadn't yet decided to trust, which was most adults. Behind them stood Emma, who was 10, and who had the look of a child who had been managing things for too long. She was holding a dishcloth, and she had clearly been in the middle of something when Clara arrived, and she was visibly annoyed that she had been interrupted. Beside Emma was a boy of about 6 named Henry, who was trying to hide behind his sister and failing because he was too curious to commit fully to hiding. His head kept appearing around Emma's arm to get a better look at Clara, and sitting on the floor near the crib, cross-legged, watching her with large, unblinking eyes, was Noah, 4 years old. He had a piece of rope in his hands that he'd been braiding, and he had stopped braiding it the moment Clara walked in, and he had not moved since. "My name is Clara," she said, to all of them, and none of them in particular. "I know this is strange. It's strange for me too." The twins said nothing. Emma said nothing. Henry disappeared behind Emma's arm again. Noah set down his rope and stood up. He walked across the room to Clara, stopped directly in front of her, and looked up at her face with an expression of complete and unguarded assessment. Then he reached out and touched the sleeve of her coat, just one finger, just for a moment, and went back to the floor and picked up his rope again. Clara had no idea what that meant, but something about it made her chest hurt in a way she didn't expect. She had not come here for this. That was the truth she kept circling back to during those first hours, as she found where things were kept and tried to understand the rough shape of how this household had been functioning. She had come here for a husband and a fresh start, not for 7 motherless children and a missing man in a cabin that leaned. She had been a seamstress in Cincinnati for 6 years since her own mother died. She had a small room above a dry goods store, decent clients, and enough money to keep herself fed and warm. It had not been a bad life, but it had been a quiet one, a narrow one. And when the letter arrived through the matrimonial bureau, this letter from a Wyoming rancher who wrote about wide skies and hard work and needing a true partner, she had felt something shift inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe. Or something close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter. She was 28 years old and she was tired of narrow. So she had written back. And then Elias had written again. And then the letters had become something she waited for, something that made the weeks between them feel too long. He was not a poetic man. His letters were practical, observational, occasionally clumsy in their sentiment, and that was precisely what had made her trust them. She had believed a man who wrote like that was incapable of deliberate dishonesty. She had been wrong. Caleb put her trunk against the east wall and stood there with his arms crossed, watching her look around the cabin. "The sleeping arrangements," he said, "are going to be a problem." "How so?" "There are 2 rooms, Pa's room and the children's room. The girls sleep in the children's room. The boys sleep on the floor out here. There's no room for you that isn't someone else's room." Clara looked at the cot he'd set up near the stove. "That's all right for now. It gets cold at night. I lived in Cincinnati. I know cold." Caleb looked at her steadily. He had his father's coloring. She would know that later when she finally met Elias. Dark hair, gray-green eyes, a particular quality of stillness that could be misread as indifference. But there was something working behind those eyes right now that wasn't indifference. It was closer to calculation. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Someone who'd cry. "The night's still young," Clara said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He turned and went back to whatever he'd been doing before she arrived, which appeared to be mending a piece of harness leather with an awl and a length of waxed cord. He did it with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for years, sitting at the table with the twins, watching him and Henry, now openly staring at Clara from around the corner of the stove. The first thing she did, after she'd set her coat on a hook by the door and her hat on top of her trunk and pushed her sleeves up to her elbows, was look in the pot on the stove. There was something in it. She was not immediately certain what. It had the color of mud and the consistency of paste, and there was a crust around the edge that suggested it had been on the heat for a long time. She picked up the spoon beside it and stirred, and the twins made a noise she could only describe as preemptive disappointment. "What is this?" Clara asked. "Supper," Emma said, with a tone that dared Clara to object. "What's in it?" Emma hesitated. "Cornmeal, and some salt, and the last of the dried beans." Clara set the spoon down. She looked at the pot. She looked at Emma. She looked at 7 children. She was including Caleb now, even though he was trying very hard to seem like he wasn't part of this conversation. And she did a quick accounting of what she had in her smaller trunk. She had brought provisions for the journey. Not many, because she hadn't expected to arrive to an empty pantry. But she had a length of dried sausage, a cloth of hard cheese, some crackers, a small bag of cornmeal of her own, and a tin of molasses she'd packed on impulse and had been vaguely embarrassed about the entire trip. She went to her trunk and opened it. "Who knows where your father keeps his skillets?" she said. Silence. Then Henry said from behind the stove, "There's one under the bench by the back door." "Thank you, Henry," Clara said. Henry's head disappeared. She made a proper supper. It was not a feast. She used the dried sausage, cut thin, and added it to a fresh batch of cornmeal mush with the last of the salt and a spoonful of the molasses. She found 3 eggs that the hens had laid that day and scrambled them into the pan. She found a heel of bread that was a day old but not gone, and she sliced it and put it near the stove to warm. It took her 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, the children watched in the same way they'd been watching her since she arrived, warily, hungrily, trying not to seem too interested. But by the time she was dishing it out, something had shifted in the room. The twins had set the table without being asked. Emma had moved the baby's crib closer to the warmth. Henry was sitting at the table with his hands folded on top of each other, the way children sit when they are trying very hard to demonstrate patience. Noah climbed up onto the bench beside her empty seat. Clara pretended not to notice. When she set the last bowl down and finally sat, all 7 children were at the table. Caleb had put down the harness. He was looking at his bowl, and his throat moved when he swallowed. The food was gone in less than 12 minutes. Noah, who had been sitting so close that his shoulder was touching her arm, used his finger to get the last of the molasses from the bottom of his bowl. He held his finger out toward her, apparently offering her a taste. "Thank you," Clara said. "But you have it." He put his finger in his mouth and looked satisfied. After supper, she washed the dishes. This was not a decision she made consciously. She just did it because the dishes needed washing and she was there. Emma came and stood beside her and began drying them without a word, in the careful, competent way of a 10-year-old who had been drying dishes since she was 7 and had developed very strong opinions about how it should be done. They worked in silence for a while. Then Emma said, without looking up from the cup she was drying, "Did you know about us? Before you came?" Clara considered her answer. She thought about what was kind and what was true, and whether those things were the same in this case. "No," she said, "I didn't." Emma absorbed this. She put the cup on the shelf. She picked up the next one. "Are you angry?" Emma asked. "Yes," Clara said. "A little." Emma looked up at her then. It seemed to surprise her. The honesty of it, maybe, or the quietness with which it was said. She was 10 years old and she had the expression of someone who had been expecting to be managed rather than told the truth. "Me too," Emma said, very quietly. "I'm angry too." Clara didn't ask what Emma was angry about. She suspected Emma was angry about a great many things, none of which could be fixed with a conversation over a wash basin. But something about sharing the same word in the same kitchen made the air feel slightly more breathable. That night, lying on the cot near the stove with the fire burning low and the Wyoming cold pressing against the cabin walls, Clara listened to the sounds of the children settling into sleep in the other room. She could hear Caleb's low voice saying something to Henry. She could hear the baby making small sounds in the crib and then going quiet again. She stared at the ceiling and went through her options the way she'd go through a ledger. Return east in 8 days on the next stage. She had $14, which might get her back to Ohio if she was careful, and nothing went wrong. She could find work. She had done it before. Or she could stay. She did not know Elias Voss. She had 31 letters and a set of lies by omission and a man she had never met. She had 7 children who did not know her. She had a cabin that leaned. She had no guarantee that anything about this situation would improve. She had no reason, by any logical measure, to stay. She heard Noah cry out in his sleep from the other room, a sharp, frightened sound, and then heard one of the twins murmur something soothing, and then quiet again. Clara put her arm over her eyes. She was still awake 2 hours later when the baby woke, and she got up in the dark to rock it, because she was already awake and someone had to, and the baby didn't care who held it as long as someone did. The baby, whose name, she would learn in the morning, was May, grabbed onto Clara's thumb and held it with the total, uncomplicated certainty of a creature who had not yet learned to be careful about trusting people. Clara sat in the dark with the baby's warm weight against her chest and thought about all the things she'd given up to get here, and all the things she was apparently staying for, and felt, for the first time in 9 days of traveling, like she had finally stopped moving. It was not peace. She was not going to pretend it was peace. But it was something. It was a baby breathing against her shoulder in a dark cabin in Wyoming, and 7 children sleeping a few feet away, and a morning coming that she had not yet decided how to face. She rocked May until the baby went slack and heavy with sleep, and then she sat there for a while longer, not quite ready to put her down. Outside, the wind moved through the valley in long, quiet rolls, pushing at the patched roof, probing the places where the clay had gone soft. The fire had settled to coals. The cold was real and close. Clara Whitfield, who had come west for a husband and found instead a leaning cabin and 7 children who didn't know what to make of her, sat in the dark and held someone else's baby and felt the particular weight of a decision she hadn't quite consciously made yet, but that her body, her hands, the fact that she was still sitting there, had apparently already made for her. She was not leaving. She just wasn't entirely sure yet what staying was going to cost her. She put May down just before dawn. The baby didn't wake. She just released Clara's thumb, made a small sound like a sigh that had given up halfway through, and went still against the cot mattress with both arms thrown out to her sides, the way infants sleep when they haven't yet learned that the world requires you to protect yourself even in your dreams. Clara stood over her for a moment, rubbing the feeling back into her thumb. Then she straightened up, looked at the dead coals in the stove, and went to work. She had the fire going and water heating before any of the children stirred. She had found the flour bin the night before. It was lower than it should have been for a household of 8. But there was enough for biscuits if she was careful. She found the lard tin tucked behind the flour. She found a clay crock of something preserved in the back of the lower shelf, peeled back the wax seal, and discovered it was apple butter, gone slightly dark at the edges, but still good underneath. Someone had made it. Someone who no longer lived in this cabin had stood at this stove and put up apple butter against the winter, and the winter was nearly gone, and most of it was still there. Clara pressed the wax seal back down. She made the biscuits. She was pulling them from the pan when she heard the first sounds from the back room. The particular thump and shuffle of children waking, which was not so different from the sound of livestock settling, just higher pitched. Then Emma appeared in the doorway in a nightgown that was too short for her, hair loose, blinking at the stove with an expression that started as suspicion and shifted involuntarily toward something more like cautious interest when she smelled the biscuits. "You're up early," Emma said. "So are you." Emma looked at the pan. She looked at the apple butter crock on the table. She looked at Clara. "We don't usually have biscuits." "I know, the flour's getting low. We'll need to be careful." That "we" landed in the room and sat there between them. Emma noticed it. Clara noticed Emma noticing it. Neither of them said anything about it. Emma went to the crib, checked on May with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this since before she was old enough to be trusted with it, then took her place at the table. Within the next 10 minutes, all 6 of the older children had found their seats, and the particular chaos of a household morning got underway. Henry knocking his cup against Leah's arm, Leah objecting, Lydia taking Leah's side on principle, Noah climbing onto the bench beside Clara's empty chair and holding his hand out for a biscuit before anyone else had been served. "Wait," Clara said. Noah pulled his hand back. He did not look offended. He looked like someone filing information for later use. She served the youngest first. May had woken and was making her opinions known from the crib. Then Noah, then Henry, then the twins, then Emma. She put the last 2 biscuits on the table in front of Caleb's empty seat and her own. Caleb came in from outside while she was opening the apple butter, bringing the cold with him and the smell of the barn. He stopped when he saw the table. "Biscuits," he said, with the flat intonation of someone identifying something unexpected in the landscape. "Sit down," Clara said, "before they get cold." He sat. He ate. He didn't say anything for several minutes, and neither did Clara, and the table was full of the sounds of children eating with the particular focused dedication that comes from real hunger rather than appetite. Noah had apple butter on his chin. Henry had it on his ear somehow, which was a logistical achievement Clara chose not to examine too closely. When the last biscuit was gone, Caleb looked at the empty pan and then at Clara. "We don't have flour for this every morning," he said. "I know." "So this was today," Clara said. "Today needed biscuits. We'll work out tomorrow when it comes." Caleb looked at her with that calculating steadiness of his. Then he got up, took his plate to the wash basin, and went back outside. Emma watched him go. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. Then she said, quietly enough that only Clara could hear, "He doesn't know how to say thank you. He never learned it." "Neither did I for a while," Clara said. "It comes eventually." Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything, then began clearing the table. The morning organized itself around the work that needed doing, which was considerable. Clara had grown up in a city, but she was not soft. Her mother had kept house with the grim efficiency of a woman who understood that comfort required constant maintenance, and Clara had been her apprentice from the time she could reach a washboard. She knew how work moved through a household. She could see where the gaps were. And the gaps in this one were everywhere. Not because the children were lazy, she understood that quickly. Caleb ran the barn and the outdoor work with a competence that most men twice his age couldn't match. Emma managed the interior with a ferocious, anxious grip. Even the twins contributed, hauling water, sweeping, keeping. Henry pointed in roughly useful directions. The problem was not effort. The problem was that they were each carrying their own piece of the household in isolation, without a center, without anyone organizing the whole. Things had been falling through the cracks for months, maybe longer, and enough small failures had compounded into something that looked, from the outside, like neglect. It wasn't neglect. It was exhaustion without direction. Clara did not announce a plan. She didn't sit the children down and tell them what was going to change. She just started doing what she could see needed doing, quietly, methodically, one thing after another, the way her mother had taught her. Because the fastest way to lose authority over a household was to talk about what you were going to do before you'd shown anyone you could do it. She repaired the clay seal around the stovepipe. She found a loose board on the east wall that was letting cold air in and nailed it flat with a hammer she found under the workbench. She inventoried what was in the pantry, carefully, completely, writing it on a piece of paper she found in the drawer beneath the table, and understood exactly how thin the margin was. 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the meal ran out. The root vegetables in the cellar were mostly gone. There were dried beans, a little salt pork, the remains of a sack of cornmeal. She went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, working a piece of tack with a soft rag, and something that smelled like rendered fat. He didn't look up when she came in. "The pantry," she said. "I know. Do you have credit at the store in town?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some. Pa has an account. I don't know how much is left on it." "What about money?" Caleb set down the tack. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to read, the look of someone deciding how much honesty a situation required. "There's some in the tin on the shelf in Pa's room, for emergencies. This qualifies." "I know." He picked up the tack again. "I was going to go to town Thursday, get what I could. I'll come with you." This time he did look at her. "Why?" "Because 2 heads are better than 1 when you're buying on a limited budget, and because I need to send a letter." Caleb's jaw moved. He understood who she was sending the letter to. "You going to tell him to hurry back?" "I'm going to tell him exactly what I found when I arrived," Clara said. "He can draw his own conclusions about whether he needs to hurry." Caleb said nothing. He bent back over the tack. Then, after a moment, "He's not a bad man." "I didn't say he was." "You think it." Clara leaned against the barn door, looking at the square of gray spring sky beyond the opening. "I think he was afraid," she said. "I think he convinced himself that if he told the truth, I wouldn't come. And I think he was probably right. I probably wouldn't have come." She paused. "But here I am anyway." So that's something. Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher around the edges, in a way that had nothing to do with his age. Our mother died 14 months ago. Fever. It went through the valley in October, and she was gone inside of a week. He didn't look up from the leather. Pa sent for you 6 weeks later. Clara absorbed this. That was fast. He was desperate. Caleb said it without judgment, but without softness either. Just the word, flat and accurate. May was 3 months old. Emma was holding everything together, but she was only 9. I was trying to run the ranch, and I didn't... He stopped, started again. I was 15. I didn't know what I was doing. You kept them alive, Clara said. Barely. Barely counts. Caleb looked up at her then. Something moved in his face that he clearly didn't intend her to see, and he looked back down quickly, but she'd seen it. It was the expression of someone who had been keeping an enormous weight in their arms for so long. They'd forgotten what it felt like to be told that what they'd done was enough. He didn't say anything else. Clara didn't push. She went back to the cabin and started on the patching the girls' dresses, 2 of which had hem tears that had been left to worsen until what had been a small repair was now a substantial one. The twins were the next wall she had to find her way around. Lydia and Leah Voss were 8 years old and had developed, somewhere in the 14 months since their mother's death, a sophisticated system of joint defense that made them almost impossible to approach individually. They operated as a unit. If one spoke to Clara, the other immediately appeared at her elbow. If Clara addressed one directly, the other would answer. They were not cruel about it. They didn't have Emma's controlled wariness or Caleb's guarded deliberateness. They were simply, completely, and efficiently closed. Clara noticed that they watched her hands, not her face, the way most of the other children did. They watched her hands. What she picked up, what she put down, how she handled things. She thought about it for 2 days before she understood. Their mother had been a woman who worked with her hands. Whatever they remembered of her, whatever it was they were still carrying, it lived somewhere in the memory of watching someone's hands move through the tasks of a day. On the 3rd morning, Clara was mending a shirt and she put it down on the table with the needle still in it. Either of you know how to sew? Oh, she said, without looking up. A pause. Mama was teaching us, Lydia said. What did she show you? Another pause, longer. Then Leah came to the table and sat down, and after a moment Lydia came too, and they looked at the shirt and the needle, and Clara said, "Show me what she showed you." And what happened next was not graceful or easy. Leah put the needle through the wrong side of the fabric twice, and Lydia corrected her in a whisper that was mostly argument, and Clara said nothing and let them work through it, because the point was not the shirt. The point was that they were sitting at the table with her and their hands were moving and they were talking to each other, which meant they were, by small increment, becoming less defended against the fact of her presence. She didn't push further that day. She just let it be what it was. Henry was the easiest and the hardest in different ways. He was 6 years old and he had all of a 6-year-old's essential emotional transparency. Every feeling that moved through him was immediately visible on his face, and he had feelings about everything. He was afraid of Clara in a way that was mostly just shyness, and it dissolved much faster than Clara expected once he discovered that she didn't mind answering questions. Henry had questions about everything. Why did the stovepipe have to be sealed with clay? Why did bread need to rise before you baked it? Why did horses need their hooves trimmed when they didn't grow as fast as fingernails? Why did the stars look different in Wyoming than they did in... And here he'd stopped and thought about it. He guessed in Cincinnati, because he'd never been to Cincinnati, but Caleb said it was very flat. It's not that flat, Clara said, but the sky is different here. There's more of it. More sky, Henry said, like he was tasting the concept. Less in the way of it. Henry thought about this for a long moment, then nodded with the solemn certainty of a child who has just organized the world into a new shape. He went back to what he'd been doing, which was trying to convince a barn cat that lived under the front step to come closer by arranging a line of small stones in what he apparently believed was a pattern the cat would find persuasive. Clara watched him from the window and felt something pull sideways in her chest. Noah was something else entirely. He was 4 years old, and he had adopted her with the uncomplicated totality that only very young children are capable of. The way a seedling will grow toward whatever light is closest, not because it has chosen that light specifically, but because growing toward light is simply what it does. He was beside her constantly, not talking, mostly. He was a quieter child than Henry, more interior, given to long periods of observation, interrupted by sudden, intense curiosity. He helped her in ways that were more hindrance than help, and she let him anyway. He handed her things she hadn't asked for, and she accepted them and thanked him, and he looked satisfied in the deep, uncomplicated way of a child whose gift has been received properly. What she hadn't expected was how much she would come to watch for him. On the fourth day, she was outside beating dust from the rugs that had been hung over the fence rail, and she turned around and Noah wasn't where he'd been. She finished the rug she was working, turned again. Still not there. She put down the beater and went to find him with a calm she did not entirely feel, and located him in the barn sitting on the hay bale, talking to one of the horses in a long, serious murmur about something she couldn't make out. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment. He hadn't noticed her. He was gesturing with one hand while he talked, making a point about something, and the horse was watching him with the patient attentiveness of a creature that understood cadence even without vocabulary. "Noah," Clara said. He looked up. "Don't wander off without telling me where you're going." "I told the horse," he said. "I am not the horse." He considered this seriously. "Okay," he said, and went back to his conversation. Clara went back to the rugs. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she told herself was from the cold. It was Emma who gave her the most trouble, and Emma who mattered most, and Clara knew both of those things were true at the same time. Emma was 10 years old, and she had been the woman of this household for 14 months, and she was not prepared to surrender that position to a stranger who had shown up uninvited, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what the biscuits and the apple butter and the mended dresses implied. Emma was polite, light. She was cooperative. She did everything Clara asked with precise, efficient compliance. And she watched every move Clara made with the focused attention of someone who is looking for the mistake that will confirm what they already believe. Clara understood this. She didn't resent it. She had been 10 years old once, a long time ago, and she remembered what it felt like to be the one holding things together when no one else seemed to understand what holding together actually cost. Emma was not going to trust her on Clara's timeline. Emma would trust her on Emma's timeline, or not at all, and pushing would only make it longer. So Clara didn't push. She worked alongside Emma, asked Emma's opinion on things when the opinion was worth asking, and quietly, carefully, started taking some things off Emma's plate without calling attention to the fact that she was doing it. The first time Emma came to do a task and found it already done, she stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Clara with a very specific expression. Not quite relief, not quite suspicion, something caught exactly between the two. "I was going to do that," Emma said. "I know," Clara said. "I was passing by." Emma stood there another moment. Then she turned and went to do something else. That was all. But the next morning, Emma put a cup of water near Clara's elbow while she was working, without being asked, without saying anything about it. And Clara drank it, and didn't say anything about it either, and that was how they negotiated, in the currency of small, unacknowledged acts, which is the oldest and most durable form of diplomacy. On the fifth day, Clara wrote the letter to Elias Voss. She sat at the table after the children were in bed and wrote it by firelight with the particular careful restraint of someone who has a great deal more to say than they are going to say. She told him that she had arrived to find him absent in the household in his oldest son's hands. She told him that the children were managing and that she was managing alongside them. She told him that she expected him to return as soon as the pass allowed. She did not tell him that she was angry. She did not tell him that she had read his 31 letters twice more since arriving, looking for any trace of the truth hidden somewhere in all those careful words, and had not found it. She did not tell him that she had held his baby daughter in the dark on the first night and had felt, despite everything, that particular cellular pull that infants exert on adult humans, regardless of biology or intention or how thoroughly a situation has been misrepresented. She folded the letter and sealed it and put it with her things for Thursday, when Caleb would take the wagon to town. Then she sat at the table for a while longer, looking at the stove. She was not all right exactly. She was functional. She was doing what needed to be done because it was in front of her, and she was not a person who left things undone in front of her. But there was a part of her that was still sitting 9 days back on a stage rattling west across the country, holding those letters, believing them, feeling the thing that was close enough to hope that it had made her chest ache. That woman was still somewhere inside her, and she was furious. Clara was going to have to deal with that eventually. Not tonight. Thursday came. Caleb brought the wagon around before breakfast, and Clara climbed up beside him with the letter in her coat pocket and the list she'd made of what the pantry needed most. They didn't talk much for the first few miles. The road to town was rough, and the morning was cold enough that conversation felt like unnecessary expenditure. Then Caleb said, without looking at her, "How much do you know about running a cattle operation?" "Less than you," Clara said. "That's not hard," Caleb said. There was no self-pity in it, just accuracy. "What do you need to know?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon hit a rut and lurched, and he corrected it with the ease of long practice. "PA handles the business side, the accounts, the arrangements with the other ranchers, the contracts for the beef sales. I handle the physical work, but I don't—" He paused. "I don't know what I don't know. About the contracts, about whether we've been getting fair value, about what the other ranchers in the valley are getting." Clara looked at him. "You think you've been taken advantage of?" "I think someone has been," Caleb said. "I think maybe Pa, because he was distracted. I think maybe us, because I'm 16 and I don't know how to read a contract properly." This was more than he had said to her at any one time since she'd arrived. She could feel the effort it cost him, the particular vulnerability of admitting ignorance to someone you weren't sure you could trust yet. "When your father gets back," Clara said carefully, "I can look at the contracts. If he'll let me." "Can you read them? Understand them?" "I can read anything put in front of me," Clara said. "Understanding contracts takes longer. But I'm not going anywhere." Caleb was quiet again. Then, barely audible over the sound of the wheels on the rutted road. "Emma cried last night. I heard her through the wall. She does that sometimes after she thinks everyone's asleep." Clara said nothing. "She doesn't do it as much as she used to," Caleb said. "She did it every night for the first 2 months, after Ma died." Clara looked at the road ahead of them. She thought about a 10-year-old girl crying quietly through a wall so her brothers and sisters couldn't hear. "I know," she said, though she hadn't known. But somehow it didn't feel like a lie. Caleb nodded, once, and they rode the rest of the way to town without speaking, which was a different kind of silence than the one at the start of the journey. The town of Dunn Creek was small in the way that frontier towns were small. Not sparse exactly, but provisional feeling, as if it hadn't quite committed to being permanent. There was a general store, a livery, a post office that also served as a telegraph station, a saloon that was shut at this hour, and a collection of other structures in various states of ambition. The man behind the counter at the general store was named Pruitt. He was a heavy-set man with a precise manner that sat slightly at odds with his surroundings, and he looked at Clara with the undisguised interest of a person who processed all new information through the lens of its social utility. "You must be the woman Elias sent for," Pruitt said. "Clara Whitfield," she said. "I'm working from a list, if you don't mind." She handed him the list. He looked at it. Then he looked at Caleb. "Account's a little stretched, son." "I know," Caleb said. "We've got cash for part of it." Clara put the tin they'd taken from Elias's room on the counter. $14.60. Pruitt counted it. Then he looked at the list again. "I can cover the cornmeal and the salt and the dried beans on account," he said. "The lard and the sugar you'll need to cash out." Clara looked at the list. Made a calculation. "The lard," she said. "We can manage without the sugar for another 2 weeks." "You sure?" Caleb said. "I'm sure." Pruitt made a note in his ledger. He had the manner of someone storing the interaction for later discussion with others. And Clara understood that by this time tomorrow, the fact of her presence in Elias Voss's household would be the most efficiently distributed piece of information in Dunn Creek. She posted her letter at the counter beside the door on the way out. On the way home, they passed a ranch on the east side of the road. There was a man outside it, large, deliberate in his movements, standing at his fence line and watching the wagon pass with the particular quality of attention that goes beyond casual observation. He didn't wave. Caleb didn't wave either. Clara noticed. "Who is that?" she said after they'd passed. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Farrow. Daniel Farrow. He owns the property between us and the river. The water rights."
Caleb looked at her sideways. How do you know about that? You mentioned contracts, Clara said. Water is always the contract that matters most out here. Anyone who's been paying attention knows that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral in the way of someone managing what they let show. He and Pa have had an arrangement for 3 years. Pharaoh lets us run our cattle to the river at certain times. We give him a portion of our beef sales in exchange. What portion? 30%. Clara said nothing for a moment, doing the arithmetic of that. Is that the arrangement your father agreed to, or the arrangement that ended up in the contract? Caleb looked at her again, more sharply this time. What's the difference? Sometimes men agree to one thing and sign another, Clara said. Sometimes by accident, sometimes not. The wagon creaked along the road. Caleb was working through something behind his eyes. She could see it. I never read the original contract, he said finally. Pa keeps all the paperwork in the desk in his room. I don't go in there. When he gets back, Clara said, I think we should ask him to show us. Caleb looked at the road ahead. His jaw was tight again in that particular way. Yeah, he said quietly. I think so too. That night, after supper, after the dishes, after the children were sorted into their sleeping places, and May had been fed and settled, and the cabin was quiet in that way it got after 8 o'clock when all the noise of a large household simply ceased at once, Clara sat down at the table with a cup of water and took the 31 letters out of her trunk. She laid them on the table. She didn't read them. She just looked at them, at the careful handwriting and the folded edges soft from handling. And she thought about a man she had never met who had been so afraid of the truth that he'd built an entire correspondence on its absence. She thought about what Caleb had said in the barn. He's not a bad man. She thought about Emma crying through a wall. She thought about a 30% arrangement and a water contract she hadn't seen. She thought about Noah telling the horse where he was going. She put the letters back in the trunk. She didn't know Elias Voss yet. She had 31 letters and a household he'd left behind, and 7 children who were beginning just barely at the edges, to look at her without calculation. She had a ranch that might have been taken advantage of by a neighbor who watched passing wagons with the particular attention of a man who was counting what was his. She didn't know yet whether Elias was a man she could build something with or a man she would have to manage around. She didn't know whether his fear had made him careless or simply cowardly. She didn't know enough about him yet to forgive him properly, which meant she couldn't do it yet, which was all right. She was a woman who needed to understand something before she could move on from it. She always had been. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a minute, listening to the wind in the valley. Then she heard Noah cry out again from the back room. That same sharp, frightened sound from somewhere inside a dream. And she waited, because she'd learned now that it usually resolved on its own, that one of the others would murmur something and it would pass. And it did, after a moment. Quiet again. Clara got up. She checked the stove damper, banked the coals against the morning, and lay down on her cot. The cabin creaked and breathed around her. May made small sleeping sounds from the crib. 14 months since their mother died. 6 weeks later, Elias had sent the first letter. A man desperate enough to lie, and desperate enough to hope that the lie would hold until the truth didn't matter anymore. She was going to have things to say to him when he finally came through that door. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley wind moved south toward the mountains, and somewhere on the east side of the road, on the land between the Voss Ranch and the river, Daniel Farrow's property sat in the dark, holding water rights and a contract that no one in this cabin had ever read all the way through. Clara didn't know yet what that was going to cost them, but she was starting to understand that there were more problems waiting in this valley than 7 children and a missing man, and that whatever came next, she was going to need to be ready for it. The contract was in the bottom drawer of Elias's desk, beneath a surveyor's map and 3 years of receipts held together with a length of twine. Clara found it on a Tuesday, the 9th day after her arrival, when Emma asked her to look for a bill of sale for one of the horses that a man from town had come inquiring about. Clara had gone into Elias's room with Emma's permission. Emma, who managed access to that room the way a magistrate manages a courthouse, with exact awareness of who had gone in and what they had touched. And she had found the bill of sale in the second drawer, but the third drawer had been slightly open, and the corner of the water contract had been visible, and she had stopped. She looked at the door. She looked at the drawer. She pulled it open. The contract was 4 pages,
written in the close, dense hand of someone who had either been a lawyer or wanted to appear as one. Clara took it to the window and read it once quickly, then went back to the beginning and read it again slowly. And by the time she finished the second reading, her jaw was tight in a way that reminded her, uncomfortably, of Caleb. The arrangement Caleb had described was 30% of beef sales in exchange for river access rights. That was what he'd been told. That was, apparently, what Elias had believed he was signing. What the contract actually said was different in several significant ways. The 30% was not calculated on sales. It was calculated on assessed value, which was a different number, and the method of assessment was defined in a subsection on the third page in writing, so small she'd almost missed it. The assessment was to be conducted annually by a party named in the contract as the appointed assessor. The appointed assessor was not a neutral party. The appointed assessor was a man named R. Calloway, who was, as far as Clara could determine from the contract language, employed by Daniel Farrow. Furthermore, the river access rights granted to the Voss Ranch were described as running at the discretion of the property holder, meaning Farrow could restrict access at any time, for any reason, provided he gave notice of 3 days. 3 days' notice to find alternative water for a cattle operation in Wyoming, in summer. The contract had been signed by Elias Voss 3 years ago, in the first autumn after his wife's death. Clara looked at his signature, a shaky, hurried thing, nothing like what she'd have expected from a man whose handwriting in his letters had been careful and deliberate. He had signed this in grief and exhaustion, and someone had known that, and had put this document in front of him at exactly that moment. She folded the contract and put it in her apron pocket. She brought the bill of sale to Emma. She said nothing about the contract that night, or the next morning, because she needed to think about what she'd found before she said anything to Caleb, and thinking required quiet. And quiet in this household was not something you could take for granted. It had to be waited for. She waited until Thursday evening, after supper, after the younger children were in bed, when Caleb was at the table working on the accounts ledger with the kind of focused misery of someone who already knows the numbers are bad and is just establishing how bad. "I need to show you something," Clara said. She put the contract on the table in front of him. He looked at it. "Where did you find this?" "Elias's desk. I was looking for the horse bill of sale." Caleb picked it up. He read it the way she had, once quickly, then back to the beginning. He read more slowly than she did, stopping at certain passages, going back. She watched his face change as he read, the particular blankness that comes over a young man's face when he is working very hard not to show what he's feeling. When he finished, he put it down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. "The assessor," he said, "works for Farrow. We've been paying on Farrow's number." "For 3 years," Clara said. Caleb sat back in his chair. He put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then looked back down at the contract. "Does Pa know?" "I don't know what your father knows. I don't know him yet." "He signed it. He signed it 3 weeks after your mother died." Clara kept her voice level. "I'm not saying he was blameless. I'm saying he was not at his best when he signed this, and I think someone knew that." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The fire made small sounds. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and total. "How bad is it?" he said finally. "I don't know exactly without more information, but if I'm reading the assessment provisions correctly, we've been overpaying by somewhere between 15 and 25% every year." She paused. "How much do you think the ranch owes on the Pruitt account?" Caleb named a figure. Clara did the arithmetic in her head and felt the number land heavily. "That's close to what the overpayment would account for over 3 years," she said. Caleb stared at the contract. He was 16 years old, and he was looking at 3 years of his family's labor being quietly redirected into someone else's pocket, and Clara could see the exact moment when fury and helplessness arrived at the same time, and he didn't know which one to be. "What do we do?" he said. "When your father gets back," Clara said, "we sit down with him, we show him this, and we find out whether there's anything that can be done legally. The contract may not be enforceable as written. I don't know enough law to say. But someone should look at it who does. There's no lawyer in Dunn Creek. There's one in Rawlins, 60 miles, but there." Clara folded the contract and put it back in her apron pocket. "Keep this between us for now. I don't want the children worried." Caleb nodded. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you for finding it." "I was looking for something else," Clara said. Sometimes that's how things get found. She took the contract back to her trunk and put it beneath the folded letters. And she lay on her cot that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about Daniel Farrow standing at his fence line, watching the wagon pass, and felt the particular cold clarity that comes when you understand that a problem is not what you originally thought it was. Elias Voss arrived on a Friday, 17 days after Clara had knocked on his door. She heard the horse before she saw him, a different rhythm from Caleb's horse, heavier, coming up the road at a canter that slowed as it reached the property line. She was in the yard, hanging washing on the line she'd strung between two posts, and she heard the hoofbeats and turned. The man who came through the gate was not what she had built in her mind from 31 letters. She wasn't sure what she'd built, exactly. Some composite of language and longing that didn't correspond to any particular image. But she had not expected this. A large man, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that was weathered past its age, and currently wearing the expression of someone approaching a situation they have been dreading for some time. He was perhaps 40, perhaps 45. He had Caleb's eyes, that gray-green quality, and Caleb's stillness, except that on a man of his age it read differently. On Caleb it read as guardedness. On Elias it read as exhaustion that had become permanent. He pulled up his horse and looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. He got down from the horse. He was moving carefully, she noticed. There was something stiff about his left side, the way he favored it coming down. He had either been hurt or he was older than he'd seemed in his letters, or both. He looped the reins over the fence post and stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify because she had never seen it on a person before. It was somewhere between relief and dread, which she would come to understand were the two feelings that had governed most of Elias Voss's decisions for the past 14 months. "You stayed," he said. "I didn't have much choice the first week," Clara said. "After that I had one and I made it." He was quiet for a moment. "How are they?" "Better than when I arrived." She kept her voice neutral. It cost her something. "May had a bit of a cough last week that I watched carefully, but it resolved. Noah's nightmares are a little better. Emma is—" She paused, picking the right word. "Managing, as she does." Something shifted in his face at each name. She watched it happen. Whatever she had expected. Defensiveness, deflection, the manner of a man who was going to make excuses. She didn't see it. What she saw was a father who had been 70 miles away in a logging camp for 17 days, and who was hearing about his children the way you hear about something you've been afraid to ask about. "Caleb?" he said. "He's kept this ranch running," Clara said. "He's also 16 years old and carrying about 4 times what a 16-year-old should carry. We can talk about that." Elias nodded. He turned and looked at the cabin, and she could see him taking in the small changes. The washing line, the sealed stovepipe visible from the yard, the garden bed she and Emma had turned and planted along the south wall. He looked at them, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she didn't want to soften toward. Not yet, because she still had things to say, and she needed to say them before she softened. "Mr. Voss," she said. He looked at her. "You wrote me 31 letters," she said. "You described this valley, this house, your work, your life. You described what you were looking for in a partner. You were specific about a great many things, but you did not once mention your children. Not one of them. Not their ages, not their names, not the fact that there were 7 of them, including a nursing infant." His jaw moved. He didn't look away. She gave him credit for that. "I need to know," she said, "whether you didn't tell me because you were afraid I wouldn't come, or whether you didn't tell me because you didn't think they were something a woman in my position would consider relevant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The first one. You were afraid I wouldn't come." "I knew you wouldn't come," he said. "If I told you, I knew it." He turned his hat in his hands. "That doesn't make it right. I know it doesn't make it right." "No," Clara said. "It doesn't. I didn't have a good way to think last fall, after Ruth died." He said the name carefully, the way you say a name that still has edges. May was so small, Caleb was killing himself trying to keep up. He stopped. Emma was 10 years old and she had stopped being 10. You understand what I mean by that. Yes, Clara said. I do. I needed someone. He said it plainly, without apology, without embellishment. I needed someone, and I thought that if I could get you here, if you could see them, you wouldn't. I thought you'd understand once you were here, that the truth would be better faced in person than on paper. He paused. I told myself that. I'm not sure I believed it entirely. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I was a man who had made a bad decision from a desperate place, which was not the same as a man who made bad decisions habitually, but she didn't know yet which kind he was, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. There's something else, she said, something we need to discuss before you go inside. She took the contract from her apron pocket and held it out to him. He looked at it. He knew what it was from the way he went still. I found it in your desk, she said. I was looking for the horse bill of sale. He took it from her. He didn't read it. He just held it, looking at his own signature on the front page. You know what's in it, Clara said. I know what I thought was in it, he said. What I agreed to. What's in it is not what you agreed to, Clara said. The assessor is Pharaoh's man. The access rights are at Pharaoh's discretion with 3 days' notice. She paused. I think you signed this without reading it carefully. I think you signed it during a hard time and trusted a man you shouldn't have trusted. Elias was looking at the contract with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the guilt of the deception, not the exhaustion of the past months, but something older and harder. The expression of a man confronting a mistake he'd known about and not known what to do with. I read it after, he said quietly. 6 months later I read it and I saw what I'd signed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the money for a lawyer. I didn't know how to... He stopped. I let it go. I kept paying and I let it go and I told myself I'd figure it out. You were going to let it keep going, Clara said. I didn't know what else to do. You could have told someone. Who? He looked at her. I didn't have anyone to tell. That sat between them for a moment. The specific loneliness of a man who had no one to bring a problem to, which was a loneliness Clara understood, even though she was angry, and the understanding of it complicated the anger in ways she hadn't quite finished sorting through. You have someone now, she said. If you want that. He looked at her for a long time. Do you? Want that? After all of this? Clara took a breath. I don't know you yet, she said. I know your children somewhat better than I know you. I know your ranch. I know what your handwriting looks like when you're trying to say something that costs you something to say because I've read it 31 times. But I don't know you. She paused. I'm willing to find out. That's the most honest thing I can give you right now. He nodded. It was a slow nod, not the nod of someone accepting terms, but the nod of someone who has been handed something they know they don't deserve and are trying to understand how to carry it properly. Then the cabin door opened, and Noah appeared on the porch. He saw his father and stood very still for a moment, the way he stood still when he was deciding something important. Then he came off the porch at a dead run, and Elias dropped to one knee and caught him, and the contract fell from his hand into the mud of the yard, and Clara watched a man hold his 4-year-old son with the total, unguarded desperation of someone who has been afraid the whole time they were away that something might have happened. The reunion with the other children was not the simple rush of relief that the moment with Noah had been. Emma came to the door and stood in it with her arms folded, watching her father cross the yard with Noah still attached to him like a barnacle. And her face did something complicated and controlled that Clara recognized as the expression of someone who has been angry for a long time and is deciding in real time whether to let that go or hold it. She held it, mostly. She let her father hug her briefly, and then she stepped back and gave him the same measured, assessing look she'd been giving Clara for the past 2 weeks. And Elias saw it and understood it and said, I know, Em, which was not an explanation or an excuse, but which Emma seemed to accept, because she moved aside to let him into the house. Henry had no such ambivalence. He crashed into his father at knee height and held on with both arms and had to be gently detached before he caused Elias to lose his balance entirely. The twins approached with the deliberate coordination of a joint operation, one on each side, and submitted to being hugged with the air of people making a concession they had decided in advance to make. Caleb shook his father's hand. It was brief and firm and correct, the handshake of someone who had been doing a man's work and was not going to pretend to be a child again simply because the adult had returned. Elias held his son's hand a beat longer than necessary, and Caleb led him, and then they both looked somewhere else at the same time. Clara stood back and watched all of this from the kitchen end of the cabin, keeping her hands busy with supper preparation because the business of this family's reunion was not hers to insert herself into. She was listening, though. She was cataloging, not analytically, not coldly, but with the attention of a woman who understood that what she was watching was the information she would need for everything that came after. Elias was not easy with the children. That was the first thing she noticed. He loved them. That was apparent in every halting, awkward, desperate gesture. But there was a gap between what he felt and what he could do with it, a gap that had probably always been there and had gotten wider since Ruth died. He asked Henry about the barn cat. He asked Lydia whether her reading had improved. He asked Emma about May's cough in a way that contained all his actual feeling but came out sounding like a practical inquiry. The children answered him. The conversation had the slight stiffness of people who are not quite sure yet how to be with each other after a period of distance. None of this was catastrophic. None of it was unfixable. But it was real, and Clara filed it away. After supper, which Clara made larger than usual, using the provisions she'd been conserving, because a man coming home from 17 days of camp food deserved a proper meal even if she was still angry with him, Elias asked to speak with her. They went outside. The evening was cold and the stars were out over the valley in the particular density that comes with altitude and absence of competing light. Clara pulled her coat around her and waited. "I want to say something properly," Elias said. "Not the way I said things before. Actually properly." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing it. "Wrong to deceive you. Not just wrong in the sense of it being a bad decision. Wrong in the sense of, I took away your choice. You had a right to know what you were coming to, and I took that right away from you because I was afraid of what you'd do with it. That's not something a man does to a woman he respects, and I'm telling you I'm sorry for it, and I'm telling you I know sorry doesn't fix it." Clara listened to this. She turned it over. It was a better apology than she'd expected, not because she'd expected him to be a bad man, but because genuine accountability was rarer than people like to believe. And she'd heard enough deflection dressed up as apology in her life to know the difference. "It doesn't fix it," she agreed, "but it's a start." "The contract—" He stopped. "I should have told you about the contract. When I showed you the property and what needed to be done, I should have told someone. You were carrying it alone. I've been carrying everything alone since Ruth died." He said it without self-pity, the way you state a weather condition. "I didn't know how not to." "That's going to have to change," Clara said. "If we're going to—" She paused, finding the right word. "If we're going to try to make this work." "What would making it work look like?" he said. "To you?" It was a real question. She could hear that it was real. He wasn't asking rhetorically or as a preamble to arguing. He was asking because he genuinely did not know, and because he was, at his core, whatever else he was, a man who had been trying to hold something together in the dark without a map. "It would look like you not making decisions about this household without talking to me," she said. "It would look like you understanding that Caleb is not a hired hand. He's your son, and he needs to be your son, not your foreman. It would look like us dealing with Pharaoh together, with the contract, properly, through whatever legal channel exists. It would look like—" She stopped. "It would look like you trusting me with the truth. All of it. Even the parts that are uncomfortable." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a considerable list." "You have 7 children," Clara said. "Nothing about this situation is not considerable." He looked out over the valley. In the dark, with the stars above them and the wind moving through the grass, she could see something in his profile that she hadn't been able to see in daylight. Something that was tired in a way that went past physical, tired in the way that people get tired when they have been afraid for a very long time. "I can try," he said. "I can't promise you I'll do all of it right. I'm not—" He paused. "I'm not a man who's been good at this. Talking, sharing things." "I know," Clara said. "I read your letters." Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. Almost. "The letters were easier," he said. "Paper doesn't look at you while you're figuring out what you mean." "No," Clara said, "it doesn't." She looked at the stars for a moment. The cold was proper now, deep and clean, the kind that reaches down through your coat. She thought about Ruth Voss, who had put up apple butter against a winter she wouldn't live to see out. She thought about a contract signed in grief by a man who needed a lawyer and didn't have one. She thought about Caleb shaking his father's hand. "There's a lawyer in Rollins," she said. "I think we need to go, as soon as you're rested enough to make the trip." 60 miles. I know. He was quiet for a moment. "You already looked into it." "I already looked into a number of things," Clara said. "I had 17 days. This time the thing that crossed his face was unambiguously a smile, brief and rueful and honest. He looked at her in the way of a man encountering, for the first time, the actual dimensions of something he'd sent for without fully understanding what he was getting. "Clara," he said. "Mr. Voss." "Elias," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Elias," she said. He nodded, as if that settled something small. Then he went inside, and she stayed outside for another few minutes in the cold, listening to the valley. What followed in the next 4 days was not reconciliation exactly, and it was not routine exactly, but it was something, the slow, careful negotiation of a household finding its new shape around an additional presence. Elias was not a man who knew how to be at home. That was the thing that became clear to Clara as she watched him those first days back. He knew how to work. He was up before light, and he threw himself at the physical demands of the ranch, with the kind of focused violence that she recognized as a man managing feelings through his body because he hadn't developed another way to do it. He fixed 3 things in the first day that had been broken for months: the gate latch, a section of fence line, the bridle hook in the barn. He worked alongside Caleb with an efficiency that clearly came from long practice, and the two of them moving through the ranch work together had the quality of a language they both spoke fluently, but in which they had stopped having actual conversations. He did not know how to be inside the cabin with the children. He hovered. He tried to help and got in Emma's way. He picked May up and then didn't know what to do with her. He sat at the table for supper, and the family ate around him, and he participated, but there was a slight delay in him, like a man translating everything in his head before speaking. On the second evening, Clara found him standing outside the room the children slept in, his hand on the doorframe, looking in at the twins who had fallen asleep over a picture book. He didn't hear her come up behind him. She stopped, watching him watch them. "They grew," he said, without turning. "While I was gone. Even just those, they grew somehow." Clara said nothing. "I keep missing it," he said. "Every time I have to go, the logging camp, the drives, I come back and something's different, and I missed it, and it doesn't come back." "No," Clara said, "it doesn't." He turned then. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't fully seen on him before. Not the guilt, not the exhaustion, but something underneath both of those, the core thing. He was afraid. He was afraid of his own children in the specific way of a man who loves something so much, the possibility of failing it has become a weight he carries everywhere. "They were better when I got back," he said, "than when I left. Not just managed, better. Lydia laughed at supper. I don't remember the last time I heard her laugh at supper." "She and Leah taught me a hand game yesterday," Clara said. "Took 4 attempts before I got it right. They found that very satisfying." Elias looked at her. "How did you do it?" "I watched their hands," Clara said, "and I let them teach me something instead of the other way around." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know how to do that. The watching and letting them." He turned back toward the door. "Ruth was good at it. She could read them the way I can read weather or terrain. I never had that." "You can learn it," Clara said. "It's not a talent. It's attention, mostly. You just have to slow down enough to pay it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound certain." "I've had 17 days," Clara said. "You've had 14 months. You know more than you think you do. You've just been too afraid of getting it wrong to try." He absorbed this without answering. She wasn't sure he agreed with it, but she thought it landed somewhere it hadn't been before. On the 4th day, Daniel Farrow came to the property. He came mid-morning, on a good horse, with the ease of a man who was accustomed to arriving places unannounced and finding his presence accepted without question. He was perhaps 50, lean and deliberate, with a quality of composed authority that Clara recognized immediately as a performance, not because it was false exactly, but because it was too precise, too consistently maintained to be entirely natural. Men who were genuinely confident in their position did not need to perform it quite this carefully. He came to the door and knocked, and Clara answered it, and he looked at her with a brief recalibration visible in his expression. He'd been expecting Caleb, or possibly Elias, and had gotten instead a woman he didn't know. "Daniel Farrow," he said. "I'm a neighbor. I heard Elias was back." "Clara Whitfield," she said. "Come in." He came in. He looked around the cabin with the assessing look of someone adding up what they're seeing, and Clara watched him do it and kept her expression pleasant and uninformative. "I'll get Elias," she said. She got Elias from the barn. On the way back, she said quietly, "He came to see whether you were actually back, and to assess." Elias looked at her. "You know about Farrow?" "I know about the contract," Clara said. "We established that." He was quiet for the rest of the walk to the cabin. The conversation between Elias and Farrow was polite in the way that conversations between men who have financial arrangements tend to be polite. On the surface, completely cordial. Underneath, a continuous and careful measurement of advantage. Clara sat at the far end of the table and mended a shirt and said nothing. Farrow looked at her twice, the second time with more curiosity than the first. They talked about the spring, about the cattle, about the state of the pass. Farrow said the assessment was coming up in June and mentioned the assessor, Calloway, with the casualness of someone naming something they expect to be uncontested. "I'll want to go over the contract before then," Elias said. "The specifics of the assessment method." Farrow looked at him. The cordiality was still there, but something shifted behind it. "The contract's clear enough." "I'd like to look at it again," Elias said. "It's been 3 years. I want to make sure I'm clear on the details." Farrow's eyes moved to Clara. She was looking at the shirt. She felt his gaze anyway. "Fine," Farrow said. He stood. He shook Elias's hand. He nodded at Clara. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Farrow," she said pleasantly, without looking up from the mending. She heard him leave. She heard the horse moving away. She set down the shirt. Elias was standing in the middle of the room with his arms at his sides, looking at the door. "He knows," he said. "He suspects," Clara said. "There's a difference, and we need to use that difference before it closes." Elias turned and looked at her. "You've done this before, this kind of thinking through a situation." "I've never dealt with a fraudulent water contract," Clara said, "but I've been managing on a small margin my whole life. The thinking's the same." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When can we go to Rollins?" "Monday," Clara said. "If you can arrange someone to watch the children." "Mrs. Alderman, 2 properties east. She's helped before." "Then Monday," Clara said. He nodded. He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment. "I should have done this 2 years ago," he said. "Yes," Clara said, "you should have." She got up and took the shirt back to the mending pile, because there was always more mending and the pile was never smaller than when she'd started. And she was starting to understand that this was going to be the shape of this life. Not a problem solved and a situation resolved, but one thing after another, each one requiring attention, none of them going away entirely. She was starting to think that was all right. She was starting to think, cautiously, without committing to it, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it, that the shape of this life, which was not the life she had come here for, might be a life she could build something in. The shirt had a tear along the collar seam that was going to take a while. She sat back down and threaded her needle and started on it, and outside the cabin. The Wyoming spring moved through the valley in long, cold waves, and somewhere on the east side of the road, Daniel Farrow rode back toward his property with the look of a man doing his own arithmetic, and the numbers were changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The road to Rollins was 60 miles of hard going, and they left before first light on Monday with Mrs. Alderman settled in the cabin and the children still asleep. Clara had packed provisions for the day, biscuits from the morning before, wrapped in cloth, and a jar of water, and a second one of cold coffee that she'd made strong enough to serve as both breakfast and fortification. Elias drove. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her coat buttoned to the throat and the contract folded in the inner pocket of her traveling bag. And for the first hour they didn't talk much because the road demanded attention and the cold demanded conservation, and there was a quality to the silence between them now that was different from the silence of strangers. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be more than it was. An hour out, when the sky had gone from black to the particular gray-blue of early Wyoming morning, Elias said, "Tell me what you think the lawyer can do." Challenge the assessment method, Clara said. The contract designates Pharaoh's own man as the assessor. That's not neutral arbitration. That's Pharaoh setting his own price. A contract with a non-neutral assessor built into it may not hold up if challenged. May not. I'm not a lawyer. That's the honest answer. He was quiet for a moment. And if it does hold up, then we understand what we're dealing with clearly, which is better than the alternative. She looked at the road ahead. The access rights worry me more. 3 days' notice to cut water access in summer is not a provision written by a man intending to honor the spirit of any arrangement. It's a lever. He built himself a lever. Elias's hands tightened slightly on the reins. She noticed. He noticed her noticing. I knew, he said. When I read it after, I knew what he'd done. I just couldn't see a way through it. You were alone, Clara said. A man alone with a problem like this either acts badly or freezes. You froze. That's the lesser sin. He said nothing for a while. Then, you're very precise about things. I grew up with a woman who didn't have the luxury of being imprecise, Clara said. My mother, she raised me on her own after my father left. Every decision she made had a margin, and she knew exactly what that margin was. She taught me to count things. What happened to her? She died when I was 22. Consumption. Clara said it the way she had learned to say it, which was straightforwardly, without bracing for the sympathy that came after, because the sympathy was always slightly off from what she actually needed, and she'd stopped trying to receive it correctly. I had the seamstress work by then. I was all right. Elias nodded. He was quiet in a way that felt like he was making room for what she'd said rather than moving past it. Ruth's mother died when she was 16, he said. She had a hard time accepting help from anyone after that. Said it was because she'd learned not to count on people staying. He paused. I think about that sometimes. Whether I gave her enough help. When she was sick. He stopped. You can't know that, Claire said. No, you can't. But you think about it anyway. Every day, he said. The road went on, the sky lightened by degrees. Clara drank some of the cold coffee and passed the jar to Elias, and he drank without looking away from the road, and the wagon creaked and settled into the long rhythm of 60 miles. The lawyer's name was Harlan Fitch, and his office was on the second floor of a building on Rawlins Main Street, above a grain merchant, reached by a staircase that had the slight lean of a structure that had been built in a hurry and had never entirely recovered. Fitch himself was a narrow man in his 50s with the particular alertness of someone who processed information quickly and had learned not to show it. He looked at the contract for 11 minutes without speaking. Clara counted. He had asked them to sit, and they sat, and he read. And the only sounds were the grain merchant moving things around below them and the occasional voice from the street. When he finished, he put the contract on his desk and looked at both of them. How long have you been operating under this? He said. 3 years, Elias said. Fitch looked at the signature page. You signed this in October of 1873? Yes. Under what circumstances? Elias told him, briefly, without elaboration. Wife recently dead, infant daughter, distracted. Pharaoh had presented it as a formality, a documentation of the verbal arrangement they'd already discussed. Fitch listened. He had his hands flat on the desk the same way Elias had sat the other night, Clara noticed, and she wondered if it was a habit of men who were thinking hard about something they couldn't quite resolve. The assessor provision, Fitch said, is the clearest problem. An assessor with a direct financial relationship to one party in a contract is not a neutral party. In contract law, that compromises the enforceability of any assessment made under that provision. He paused. The access restriction provision is more complicated. It's unconscionable in practice. 3 days' notice is effectively no notice for a cattle operation of any size, but unconscionability is harder to argue in a territorial court than you might expect. What would you recommend? Clara said. Fitch looked at her. He had been including her in the conversation since they'd arrived, which she'd noted with quiet appreciation, because not all men in his position would have. I'd recommend a formal letter challenging the assessment methodology, citing the conflict of interest in the assessor designation, Fitch said. Serve to Pharaoh with a copy to the county recorder. This puts him on notice that you're aware of the problem and that any future assessment conducted by Callaway will be challenged. He paused. It doesn't undo the 3 years of overpayment. That's a harder argument, and a longer one, and I want to be honest with you about what it would cost in time and fees against what you might recover." "We understand that," Clara said. Fitch looked at her again, and there was something in his expression that she recognized as a man revising an assumption. "There's also the question of the other ranchers in the valley. If Pharaoh has done this once, he may have done it more than once. A collective challenge is considerably stronger than an individual one." Clara and Elias looked at each other. "How many other ranchers have river access arrangements with Pharaoh?" Clara said. "That I couldn't tell you, but the county recorder's office has all filed contracts. You could look." They looked. The county recorder was a meticulous woman named Mrs. Holt, who kept her files in a system of her own invention that was more efficient than anything Clara had seen in a public office. When Clara explained what they were looking for, Mrs. Holt produced 4 additional water access contracts between Daniel Pharaoh and neighboring ranchers, spanning the past 6 years. Clara and Elias read them at a table in the corner of the recorder's office. All 4 used the same assessor designation. 3 of them contained the same 3-day access restriction provision. Elias sat back in his chair. "He's been doing this for 6 years." "At least," Clara said. "The other ranchers, do they know?" "I would assume not, or they've known and done the same thing you did, frozen." She was looking at the names on the contracts. 3 she recognized from Caleb's mentions in passing. 1 she didn't. "Henderson. Do you know Henderson?" "James Henderson. He's got the property north of the Alderman place. Good man. Had a bad year last year. Lost a third of his herd to a sickness that went through." Clara thought about that. A bad year and 30% of your beef sales going to an assessor working for the man holding your water rights. "He lost more than the herd," she said. Elias was quiet. "We need to talk to them." "Yes," Clara said, "we do." She asked Mrs. Holt if she could get copies made of the relevant contract pages. Mrs. Holt said she could have them ready by the following morning. Clara thanked her. They went back to Fitch and told him what they'd found. And Fitch looked at the 4 additional contracts and was quiet for a moment with his hands flat on the desk again. And then he said something that Clara had not expected. "I'll write the letters for a flat fee," he said. "All 5 of them. If you can get the other ranchers to agree to proceed jointly." "Why?" Elias said. Fitch looked at the contracts on his desk. "Because this is the kind of thing I became a lawyer to deal with," he said. "And because I've heard Pharaoh's name in this office before, in connection with other things, and I think it's time someone dealt with him properly." Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at Clara. Something passed between them that wasn't quite communication yet, wasn't quite the shorthand of people who know each other well, but was the beginning of it, the first evidence of a shared language developing. "All right," Elias said. "Yeah." They stayed the night in Rollins at a boarding house that was clean and cold in equal measure, in separate rooms, because whatever was developing between them had not developed that far, and they were both too careful and too honest to pretend otherwise. Clara lay awake for an hour listening to the sounds of a town at night, which were different from the sounds of a valley, and thought about the 4 names on those contracts and the arithmetic of 6 years of overpayment, and thought about Pharaoh on his horse coming through the gate with his composed, deliberate performance of a man who knew he was owed things. She thought about Ruth Voss's apple butter, still in the crock on the shelf. She thought about Caleb's handshake. She thought about Emma saying, very quietly, "Me too. I'm angry too." The drive home was longer in the way that return journeys are always longer. You know every mile of it, and can't be surprised into not counting. They picked up the copies from Mrs. Holt in the morning and left Rollins by 9 and reached the Valley Road in the late afternoon with the light going amber across the grass. They stopped at Henderson's property on the way through. James Henderson was a man in his late 30s with a weathered, open face and the particular wariness of someone who has been managing a slow bad luck for long enough that he started to take it personally. He came to his gate when he heard the wagon and looked at Elias with the combination of surprise and reserve that suggested the 2 men knew each other without being close. "Elias, heard you were back." "James, this is Clara Whitfield. She'll be joining the household." Henderson looked at Clara with the same frank assessment that everyone in this valley seemed to apply to anything new. "Ma'am." "Mr. Henderson," Clara said, "we found something in Rollins that concerns you. Would you have a few minutes?" They had more than a few minutes. Henderson read the copy of his own contract at his kitchen table with his wife, a small, precise woman named Dorothy, who read faster than her husband and whose expression shifted from polite attention to fixed and controlled fury about halfway through the second page. Calloway, Dorothy Henderson said. He came last June. He walked through our herd for an hour and gave us a number. I thought it was low. James thought I was... She looked at her husband. I thought she was worrying, Henderson said. He said it the way a man says something he has understood, since that he should have listened to. You weren't worrying, Clara said to Dorothy. You were right. Dorothy Henderson looked at her with an expression of such complete and immediate recognition that Clara felt the distance between them collapse several miles at once. They left the Hendersons with copies of the relevant documents and the name of Harlan, Fitch, and Rollins, and Dorothy Henderson's assurance that she would personally ensure her husband drove to the other 3 ranchers before the week was out. She'll do it too, Elias said, as they pulled out of the Henderson gate. I know, Clara said. I could tell. You can tell a lot about people quickly. I've had to, Clara said. When you don't have much margin, you learn to read what's in front of you. She paused. It's not always accurate. I read your letters as honest. He was quiet for a moment. Most of them were. I know, she said. That's what made the omission work. He had nothing to say to that. She hadn't expected him to. When they got back to the cabin, the first thing Clara heard was raised voices. Not angry voices. She would come to understand the distinction quickly in a household this size. The difference between the flat, sharp sounds of real conflict and the elevated, performative sounds of children who are arguing about something that doesn't actually matter. This was the second kind. Lydia and Henry, volume high, stakes low, the specific pitched argument of 2 children who had been in each other's company for too many consecutive hours. Mrs. Alderman was sitting in the chair by the stove with May in her lap, and the expression of a woman who had managed this situation down to a level of tolerance and was content to hold it there. They've been at it since noon, she said to Clara without heat. Fed them, they played fine, then something about the barn cat's name, and it's been like this since. Noah was sitting in the corner with his rope, entirely unbothered by the noise, braiding with focused concentration. Emma was at the table with her back to the argument, doing her letters with the elaborate dignity of someone demonstrating that she is above what is happening. Clara took off her coat, hung it by the door, and said, without raising her voice, Lydia, Henry, outside. The argument stopped. Both children looked at her. Not to be punished, she said. There's water to be carried from the well. 2 people makes it faster. There was a moment of negotiation happening silently in both children's expressions. The calculation of whether the task was an acceptable exit from an argument that had probably run its natural course anyway. Then Henry got up and Lydia followed, and they went outside, and within 2 minutes Clara could hear them talking about something else entirely. The argument apparently abandoned without resolution, which was how most arguments actually ended when you gave them a different direction to run. Mrs. Alderman watched this with something like admiration. You have a way with them, she said. I'm learning them, Clara said. There's a difference. She took May from Mrs. Alderman's arms and settled her on her hip, and May grabbed her collar and looked up at her with the solemn, bottomless attention of a 10-month-old encountering the universe one face at a time. She missed you, Mrs. Alderman said, collecting her things. Clara looked at May. May looked at Clara. There was something in the baby's expression that was neither recognition exactly, nor the blank attention of a creature who doesn't know the difference between one person and another. It was somewhere between the two. It was something that Clara did not yet have the right word for, but which she felt with a specificity that surprised her. I know, Clara said. I missed her too. Elias ate supper with the family that night in a way that was different from the previous evenings since his return. He was not hovering. He was not performing the motions of fatherhood with the slightly too careful manner of someone trying to get something right. He was just there. He helped Henry cut his meat without being asked. He answered Emma's question about the trip without making it into a report. He held May when Clara needed both hands, and he sat at the table afterward when the meal was done and the children were still there, and didn't immediately look for a reason to stand up. Clara noticed. She thought the children noticed too, though they said nothing. The household had a kind of weather, she'd come to understand. emotional pressure systems that moved through it and changed the quality of the air. And the weather tonight was different from what it had been. Caleb noticed most of all. He was quiet throughout supper in a different way than his usual quiet. Not guarded, but watchful. He was watching his father at the table with the expression of someone who is comparing something to a memory and finding the comparison unexpectedly close. After the younger children were in bed, Caleb stayed at the table. Elias stayed. Clara made coffee, real coffee, the small tin she'd been parceling out, and put 3 cups on the table and sat down. The 3 of them sat with their cups, and Clara put the contract copies on the table, and they talked through what Fitch had said and what Henderson had said and what Dorothy Henderson had promised to do. And Caleb asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and Elias answered them without flinching from the parts that reflected badly on himself. And Clara watched the 2 of them in conversation, actually in conversation, not in the parallel talk of men working alongside each other, and felt something settle slightly in the household's atmosphere. It was not fixed. Nothing in this situation was close to fixed, but it was the beginning of something being faced together rather than alone, which was a different thing and a better one. When Caleb finally went to bed, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at his father. "I'm glad you're back," he said. It came out slightly rough, the words of someone who isn't used to saying what they mean directly and has decided to do it anyway. Elias looked at his son. "I'm glad to be back," he said. Then, after a moment, "You did well, Caleb, while I was gone. You always do. I don't say it enough." Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went. Elias sat looking at the empty doorway. Clara drank her coffee and let him have the silence. The letter from Pharaoh arrived 10 days later. Clara was the one who brought it in from the post because she had been to Pruitt's store that morning for a few things, and Pruitt had handed it across the counter with the expression of a man who knew more about its contents than a postmaster strictly should. She recognized Pharaoh's handwriting from the copies of the contracts, close, deliberate, the writing of a man who believed precision was a form of authority. She put it on the table when she got home and waited for Elias. He opened it. He read it. His face did the thing she'd seen it do with the contract, the particular controlled stillness of a man processing bad news. He handed it to Clara. Pharaoh had heard. He wrote with the smooth indirection of a man stating conclusions without revealing his sources, that certain inquiries had been made in Rollins regarding existing property agreements. He wanted to make clear that the existing arrangement between his property and the Voss Ranch was legally documented and fully binding, and that he expected the June assessment to proceed as customary with Mr. Calloway conducting the evaluation. He also wanted to note, in the spirit of neighborly clarity, that the water access provision of their agreement would require the full 3-day notification period to be honored in all cases, without exception, and that any deviation from the agreed terms on the Voss side would necessitate a review of the access arrangement itself. It was a threat. It was written in the language of legal courtesy, but it was a threat. He was telling Elias that if they pushed on the contract, he would shut off the water. Clara put the letter down. Elias was standing by the window, looking out at the property. "If he cuts the water in June," he said, "before the summer rains, we lose a significant part of the herd." "I know. We can't absorb that, not with the Pruitt account where it is." "I know that too." Clara looked at the letter. "He sent this because he knows we went to Rollins. He knows we saw a lawyer. He's trying to make us back down before the other ranchers have time to organize." "Is it working?" Elias said, without irony, without defensiveness. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know what she thought. She considered it. She thought about the margin, the real margin, the number that mattered. She thought about Dorothy Henderson saying she would personally ensure her husband drove to the other properties. She thought about 4 contracts in Mrs. Holt's files, 6 years, the same assessor. "No," she said. "He can threaten to cut access, but if he actually does it, to you and to the other ranchers, he's not threatening anymore. He's acting, and acting leaves evidence. Fitch said that if we had documented proof of the access being used as retaliation for a legal challenge, the unconscionability argument gets considerably stronger." She paused. "He knows that. That's why this is a letter and not an action. He's hoping the threat is enough." Elias turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm cautious of him," Clara said. Fear is different. Fear makes you freeze. I've spent enough time watching what freezing costs to know I don't want to do it." He was quiet. Then, "What do we do with the letter?" "Send a copy to Fitch. Send a copy to Henderson. Document it." She looked at it on the table, and write back, formally, telling Pharaoh that any restriction of access will be documented and submitted to the territorial court as evidence of retaliatory action in response to a legal challenge. "You think he'll back down?" "I think he'll wait," Clara said. "He's a patient man. He got those contracts signed by waiting for the right moment. People in grief, people in debt, people who needed the water and didn't have time to read the fine print. He'll wait and see whether we follow through or whether we get tired and give up." She picked up the letter. "We don't give up." Elias looked at her with an expression she had seen on him only a few times, but was starting to recognize. It was the expression of a man in the presence of something he had not expected and was not entirely sure what to do with, but which he understood, at a level below articulation, was something he needed. "No," he said. "We don't." Quote. The next weeks moved with the particular density of a period when several things are happening at once, and none of them have resolved. Fitch wrote the formal challenge letter. Henderson confirmed that 2 of the other ranchers had agreed to proceed jointly. A third, a man named Burgess, who was older and more fearful of disruption, had declined. 4 of the 5 were enough for a joint filing, Fitch said, which was enough to proceed. The response from Pharaoh's side was silence, which was a kind of answer. Inside the cabin, things continued to develop in the uneven, non-linear way that things develop when you're in the middle of them and can't see the shape from outside. Emma had started leaving space for Clara in the kitchen. Not large space, not without occasional territorial friction, but space. She asked Clara's opinion on the garden planting and received it and argued with part of it and implemented a compromise that was better than either of their original positions, which Clara thought was a reasonable outcome and said so. And Emma's expression in response to this was the nearest thing to uncomplicated pleasure that Clara had seen on her face. The twins had escalated the hand game to a level of complexity that now required Clara's full concentration, which they found enormously satisfying. Leah had begun talking more, or talking more to Clara specifically, which seemed to be a new category she'd created, about small, specific things. A bird she'd seen, something Henry had said that was actually funny, what she thought the barn cat was really named regardless of what Henry believed. Henry remained Henry, which was to say relentlessly curious and frequently muddy and impossible not to be fond of. Noah had begun greeting Clara in the mornings with a report on the previous night's dreams, delivered with the same serious, detailed manner he used for everything, as if the dreams were current events she needed to be briefed on. She listened to all of them. Some of them were strange and some of them were funny, and some of them were, in the particular unguarded logic of a 4-year-old sleeping mind, unexpectedly sad. And she listened to those ones most carefully of all, because the things children dream about are often the things they can't find words for while they're awake. May was 11 months old and had recently discovered that she had opinions about what direction she was carried in, and communicated these opinions with great clarity. And Caleb was the one that Clara watched most carefully, because Caleb was the one whose change was the slowest and therefore the most meaningful. He had started leaving her small things, not literally. It wasn't that. It was more that he had begun including her in the casual perimeter of his awareness in a way he hadn't before. If he found something in the barn that needed fixing inside the house, he told her. If he was going to be late for supper, he mentioned it. If he heard something in town that might matter to the household, he brought it back. Small things. The things you share with someone you've decided is in the circle of people whose knowing matters. She didn't comment on it. She received each piece of information with the same matter-of-fact attention she'd give a colleague, and she gave him information back in the same currency, and the transaction built, increment by increment, into something she was beginning to think of as trust. It was Emma who finally broke. Not broke in the way of something going wrong, broke in the way that things break open when the pressure inside them has been building long enough. It was a Thursday evening, late, after everyone was asleep, and Clara was at the table writing a letter to Fitch with the updated information about Pharaoh's response, and she heard a sound from the children's room that she'd learned to distinguish now. Not the sharp cry of Noah's nightmares, Not the restless sounds of children too warm or too cold, but the particular suppressed quality of someone crying who was trying not to be heard. Clara sat for a moment. She finished the sentence she was writing. She put down the pen. She went to the children's room door and knocked, very softly. Silence. "Emma," she said, quietly enough that it wouldn't reach the other side of the room where the boys slept. "I'm not going to make you open the door, but I'm here if you want." A long silence. Then the sound of movement, and the door opened a few inches. Emma's face in the low light was the face of a 10-year-old girl, which was something Clara had not quite seen before. Because Emma wore the face of someone older than 10 as a matter of policy, and had worn it so consistently that it had become, to some degree, real. But this was the face underneath, swollen eyes, mouth pressed tight in the effort to control itself. Clara sat down on the floor outside the door, because that put her at Emma's level, and because sitting on the floor is what you do when you want someone to understand you're not going anywhere. Emma looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down on the other side of the door frame, in the exact posture of someone who is not quite inside and not quite outside. They sat in silence for a moment. "I had a dream about Mama," Emma said. "What happened in it?" "Nothing. She was just in the kitchen, doing normal things." Emma's voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the effort being applied to them is enormous. "She didn't even talk to me. She was just there." Clara didn't say anything about that being a nice dream, or that her mother was somewhere watching over her, or any of the other things that people said in these moments because they couldn't bear the silence. She said, "What was she doing in the kitchen?" Emma blinked. "What? What was she doing? In the dream?" Emma thought about it. I think she was making bread. She used to make bread on Thursdays. She had a certain way of doing the kneading. Her sleeves were rolled up. What did her hands look like? Emma was quiet for a moment. Then something in her face changed. The straining effort of control shifted into something different, something that was not easy, but was more real. "She had a scar on her right hand," Emma said, "from a burn when she was young. She never told us how she got it. We used to make up stories about it." She stopped. "I was afraid I was going to forget that. I've been afraid of that for months. And in the dream I could see it, the scar." "You remembered it," Clara said. "In the dream." "You remembered it," Clara said again. "Your mind kept it. That's yours. No one takes that." Emma sat with this. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at them, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been holding a very specific grief so tightly for so long that loosening the grip even slightly feels dangerous. "I'm afraid you're going to leave," Emma said. It came out plainly, without accusation, just the fact of it. "I know," Clara said. "Are you?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She was honest with this child. She had made that choice early, and she intended to keep it. "I don't plan to. I'm not going to tell you I never will, because I don't make promises I can't guarantee. But I'm not planning to." Emma looked at her. "What's the difference between planning and promising?" "Planning is what you intend when everything is going right," Clara said. "Promising is what you intend even when it's going wrong." She paused. "I'm working toward the promise. I'm not there yet, but I'm working toward it." Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything, and Clara could see her weighing it, testing its structure the way you test a board before you put your weight on it. She was 10 years old and she had learned, at cost, that the structure of things mattered, that what things were made of was what determined whether they held. "Okay," Emma said finally. "Just that." "Okay." She stood up. She looked at Clara for a moment. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Emma." Emma went back into the room and Clara heard her settle. She sat on the floor outside the door for another minute, in the quiet of the sleeping house, and then she got up and went back to the table and finished the letter to Fitch. Her handwriting at the bottom of the page was a little less steady than the top, but it was legible, and it said what it needed to say, and that was enough. Elias found her still at the table an hour later when he came through to bank the stove for the night. He looked at the letter, the pen, the cup of cold coffee she hadn't drunk. "Emma?" he said. He'd heard, she thought, or sensed, the particular parental awareness that persists even through sleep. "She's all right," Clara said. She had a dream about Ruth. He stood there with his hand on the stove damper, looking at the door to the children's room.
She doesn't tell me, he said, when she has those. I know. She used to right after. She'd come get me and I'd... He stopped. I didn't know what to say. I never knew what to say. So eventually she stopped coming.
Clara looked at the letter on the table. She doesn't need you to say anything, she said. She needs you to sit on the floor outside the door. Elias looked at her. Is that what you did? Yes. He was quiet for a long time, his hand still on the damper. Then he said very quietly, I didn't know that. Now you do, Clara said. He stood there another moment. Then he banked the fire and went back to his room, and Clara put the letter in the envelope and sealed it and sat in the quiet of the banked-down cabin, with the coals giving off their last heat and the Wyoming night pressing at the walls, and thought about Emma's mother's scarred hand and the bread made on Thursdays, and the particular mercy of dreams that give you back the specific detail you were most afraid of losing. She sat there until the cabin was genuinely cold, and then she lay down on her cot, and she was almost asleep when she heard Elias's door open, very quietly, and his footsteps crossed to the children's room, and the soft sound of him sitting down on the floor outside the door, in the dark, without saying anything. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley moved through another night toward morning, and 4 ranchers in Sweetwater Valley were waiting on a letter from a lawyer in Rawlins, and a man named Pharaoh was waiting to see if the threat had been enough. And in a cabin that leaned slightly east, a family was finding its shape around the spaces where things had been lost, imperfectly and slowly, the way all real things are built. Fitch's formal response to Pharaoh arrived in the 2nd week of May, and it arrived not as a single letter, but as 5, one for each of the 4 ranchers, and a copy filed with the territorial court recorder in Rawlins. Clara read it at the table with Elias standing behind her, and she read it twice the way she read everything that mattered, and when she finished, she put it flat on the table and let out a slow breath. Fitch had found something they hadn't known to look for. Buried in the original territorial land grant documentation for the river corridor, filed in 1869, was a provision stating that water access rights along that particular stretch of the river could not be exclusively contracted to any single private party, where doing so would create undue hardship for established agricultural operations in the surrounding area. It was old language, territorial rather than state, and its enforceability was not absolute. But it meant that Pharaoh's contracts, all of them, had been written against a provision that complicated their legal standing considerably. Fitch's letter to Pharaoh stated this plainly. It also stated that the 4 ranchers were prepared to file a joint complaint with the territorial court, challenging both the assessment methodology and the exclusivity of the access arrangement, and that documentation of any retaliatory restriction of water access had been prepared for submission as supplementary evidence. It was not a knockout blow. Fitch had been honest about that. He'd written to Elias separately to say that this would likely proceed to some form of negotiated settlement rather than a clear legal victory, that Pharaoh had resources and would use them, and that patience was going to be required. He's not going to fold easily, Elias said. No, Clara said, but he's not going to cut our water either, not now that it's documented. The risk shifted when we filed. Elias was quiet for a moment. Henderson came by yesterday while you were with the children. He said Dorothy wants to come meet you. Clara looked up from the letter. She said, Elias paused, with the slight expression of a man quoting something he found difficult to categorize. She said anyone who managed to get James to drive 60 miles to a lawyer in under a week is someone she needs to know. Clara felt something move in her chest that was simple and uncomplicated, the specific warmth of being recognized by another woman who understood what the work actually cost. Tell her she's welcome any time. Pharaoh responded 3 weeks later, through his own lawyer in Cheyenne, a more expensive production than Fitch, which was itself a form of communication, the legal equivalent of arriving at a fence line on a very good horse. The response challenged the applicability of the 1869 territorial provision, argued that the assessment methodology was within contractual norms, and made no mention of the water access threat. That last part told Clara everything she needed to know about where Pharaoh's actual vulnerability was. The negotiation took the better part of the summer. It was not dramatic in the way that courtroom arguments are dramatic. It was the particular grinding, unglamorous drama
of paperwork and waiting and letters that had to be read carefully and responded to carefully and sent back through a chain of offices that moved at the pace of frontier bureaucracy, which was not fast. There were weeks when nothing seemed to happen. There were 2 weeks in July when Elias came close to saying they should settle for whatever Pharaoh offered, because the summer heat was hard and the herd needed attention, and the cost of Fitch's time was adding up even at the reduced rate the lawyer had agreed to. Clara sat with him on the porch on a July evening and let him say all of it, because he needed to say it, and because she had learned by then that Elias's discouragement was not a position he was arguing from, but a pressure he needed to release before he could think clearly again. When he finished, she said, "What would Ruth have done?" He looked at her sharply. "I'm not using her against you," Clara said. "I'm asking because you knew her, and you know whether she was the kind of person who stopped when things got hard, or the kind who kept going."
Elias was quiet for a long time. The evening moved around them, the grass bending in the warm wind, the children's voices coming distantly from behind the cabin where Caleb had organized some kind of game that even Emma had been drawn into. "She was the second kind," he said. "I thought so," Clara said. "From the apple butter." He looked at her. "What?" "She put up apple butter in the fall she was sick," Clara said. "She was ill in October and she still put up the apple butter. A woman who does that is not a woman who stops when things get hard." She paused. "You married her. I think some of that is in you somewhere." Elias looked at his hands. Then he looked out at the valley. Then, in a voice that was quiet and slightly rough, in a way that had nothing to do with the heat, "Don't stop pushing on this." "I'm not planning to." "I know." He exhaled slowly. "That's why I'm saying don't let me stop you if I start talking like I did just now." Clara looked at him, this large, tired, complicated man who was trying, imperfectly and seriously, to become someone who didn't carry everything alone. She thought about 31 letters and a first night in a dark cabin with a baby and a missing man and 7 children who didn't know her. She thought about how far the distance was between where they'd started and where they were sitting now, on this porch, in this valley, with the children's voices in the background and the Pharaoh negotiation in its files on the table inside. "All right," she said. He nodded. They sat until the light went and Caleb brought the children in for supper, and that was the last time Elias mentioned settling. The settlement came in September, 2 days after the first cold snap of the season. It was not everything. Fitch had told them it wouldn't be, and he was right. Pharaoh did not admit to any wrongdoing in the assessment provisions. His lawyer had been thorough enough to ensure that. But the settlement restructured all 4 water access contracts, replacing the private assessor provision with a neutral third party appointed by the county, removing the 3-day access restriction entirely in exchange for a modified fee schedule, and establishing that access rights were guaranteed regardless of any legal disputes between the parties. The overpayment of the past 3 years was partially addressed through a reduction in the fee schedule going forward, not a direct repayment, which Pharaoh's lawyer had refused, but a reduction that would, over 3 years, recover most of the difference. Caleb read the settlement document at the table with the same careful, slow attention he'd brought to the original contract, going back over certain passages, stopping at certain numbers. When he finished, he looked up at Clara. "It's not everything," he said. "No," Clara said. "It's not. But it's enough. It's enough to work with," Clara said, "which is all most things are." Caleb looked at the document again. He was 17 now. He'd had a birthday in August, which the children had observed with the particular Voss family approach to celebration, which was practical and genuine and slightly awkward in the way of people who weren't sure how much sentiment was allowed. Emma had made a cake. Noah had given him the rope he'd been braiding since March, completed at last into something that was technically a halter, though an unusual one. Caleb had accepted it with full seriousness. "I'm going to learn to read contracts properly," Caleb said. "I want to understand them the way you do." "Better than I do," Clara said. "I'm self-taught. You could learn from someone who actually knows what they're doing." "Fitch? Or someone like him? There are people who can teach this." She paused. "You could do more than run this ranch, Caleb. That's not an insult to the ranch." He looked at her steadily. "I know what it's not." "I know you do." He folded the settlement document and put it in the desk. Elias's desk, which was also, by now, where Clara kept the household accounts. a transition that had happened so gradually that no one had formally noted it, and went back to work. Clara and Elias were married on the 15th of October, 6 months after she'd knocked on a door expecting one life and found an entirely different one. It was not a large ceremony. There was no one to invite from Clara's side except the life she'd left behind, which was not a life that had people waiting in it, and on Elias's side there was the Valley, Henderson and Dorothy, who came with their 3 children, and Dorothy's particular warm, brisk efficiency that Clara had come to be genuinely grateful for. Mrs. Alderman came. Pruitt came from town and stood in the back with his hands folded and looked for once like he was observing something rather than cataloging it for distribution. The children were the ceremony, in the way that mattered. They were the reason it had meaning and the measure of what it was for. Noah wore his good shirt and spent the first part of the proceeding standing directly in front of Clara and looking up at her face with his usual grave, attentive expression, as if she were a weather pattern he was tracking. Henry's shirt came untucked within the first 10 minutes and stayed that way. The twins stood together with their arms linked, not in their usual posture of joint defense, but in something softer, the posture of 2 people who have decided that what is happening is good and are allowing themselves to feel that without qualification. Emma stood beside Clara. It was Emma who had asked, 2 weeks before, in the middle of an ordinary morning while they were working in the kitchen together, whether she could stand beside Clara at the ceremony. She had asked it with the careful, practical manner she used for everything, but her hands had been still on the washboard, which was how Clara had learned to read when something was costing Emma something to say. "I'd like that very much," Clara had said. Emma had nodded and gone back to the washing, and nothing more was said about it. But on the morning of the ceremony, Emma had appeared in Clara's room doorway, in her good dress, with her hair braided with a concentration that suggested she had done and redone it several times, and had said, "Your collar is uneven," and had reached up and straightened it with quick, sure fingers, and then stepped back and looked at her work. "There," Emma had said. Just that. Clara had felt the word settle somewhere it was going to stay. Caleb had shaken Elias's hand again afterward, the way he had when Elias returned from the logging camp. That brief, firm, serious handshake. Except this time he held it a moment longer, and this time Elias pulled his son in with his other hand, briefly, and Caleb let him, and then they both straightened up and looked elsewhere at the same time in the identical way of 2 people who have inherited the same emotional vocabulary. Clara, watching from across the room, thought, "There it is. There's the thing that was waiting to happen." The winter that followed was hard in the straightforward way of Wyoming winters. Cold that required constant management, work that didn't stop because the temperature dropped, a household that needed to function under conditions that were fundamentally indifferent to the wishes of the people living inside it. It was also the best winter Clara could remember in a long time. Not because it was easy. It wasn't. May had a real sickness in January. Not the mild cough from the fall, but a chest sickness that kept Clara up 3 nights running with the particular alert, exhausted vigilance of someone who knows that the outcome is not guaranteed and is determined to give it every available chance. Elias sat up with her the first night without being asked, and the second, and on the 3rd night when May's breathing finally eased and the fever broke, Clara put her forehead down against the side of the crib and felt the particular shaking relief that lives on the other side of sustained fear. Elias put his hand on her back. He didn't say anything. She was grateful for that. In February, a letter came from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the amended water access arrangement had been filed and recorded, making it a matter of public record rather than private contract, which meant, Fitch wrote in his accompanying note, that any future attempt to revert to the previous terms would require a public legal proceeding rather than a private renegotiation. Farrow had lost the ability to manage the situation quietly. Clara read the letter twice, put it in the desk, and went back to what she'd been doing, which was helping Lydia and Leah assemble a puzzle they'd received from Dorothy Henderson at Christmas, a thing of 47 pieces that had been occupying the twins on and off for 6 weeks, and was approximately 2/3 complete, the remaining third having achieved the particular status of puzzle pieces that have been looked at so long they've become invisible. "That one," Clara said, pointing. Leah looked at the piece, looked at the puzzle, looked at the piece again, put it in place. "I knew that," Leah said. "I know you did," Clara said. Lydia, on Clara's other side, made a sound that was either agreement or the suppression of laughter. Clara didn't examine it too closely. "Well, in March," Caleb told Elias. He wanted to spend a week in Rawlins in the spring, learning what he could from Fitch about contract law. He said it at supper, directly, in the way he'd been learning, slowly, imperfectly, to say things that mattered directly. Elias said yes without hesitation. Caleb looked slightly surprised by this, which told Clara that he'd been braced for an argument, had prepared for it, and now had to readjust. He nodded. He ate the rest of his supper. Later, washing up, he said to Clara quietly, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," Clara said. "You asked him. He said yes." "You told him to let me be his son," Caleb said. "You told him I didn't need more responsibility. He listened to you." Clara handed him a plate to dry. "He listened because it was true and he already knew it. I just said it out loud." Caleb dried the plate. "Still," he said. "Still," Clara agreed. By spring, the ranch was running with a clarity it hadn't had before. Not because everything was resolved, because everything never is, but because the people running it were doing it together rather than in their individual silos of effort and fear. Elias had learned, slowly and not without backsliding, to say what he was thinking before it became a problem he was managing alone. Clara had learned, slowly and not without her own backsliding, to let him carry some things without immediately figuring out a better way to carry them. They were not a simple partnership. They argued. Clara had opinions that were direct, and Elias had a stubbornness that was deep. And there were evenings where the supper table had a particular quality of charged silence that the children had learned to navigate around. Emma, who missed nothing, would look at Clara at these moments with a steady, assessing gaze that contained the ghost of a question. Clara would meet that gaze and give a small, honest shake of her head. Not bad, just difficult. And Emma would nod and go back to her supper. That was real. That was the actual texture of it, the rough places as well as the ones that had worn smooth. People tell stories about families and they tend to sand down the difficult parts, make the love sound effortless, make the togetherness sound inevitable. Clara thought that was a disservice. Not just inaccurate, but actively misleading about what it costs to build something with other people, what it requires you to put down, and what it requires you to keep picking up. Elias was not an easy man to know, and Clara was not a simple woman to love. And 7 children are 7 separate, complete, contradictory human beings in various stages of becoming themselves. And the daily work of attending to all of that was the real love story, unglamorous and continuous, nothing like 31 letters. But here is what Clara also knew from the other side of that difficult year. The things you stay for matter more than the things you arrive for. She had arrived for a husband she'd imagined through handwriting. She had stayed for May's weight against her shoulder in the dark, and Emma's straightened collar, and Noah's morning dream reports, and Caleb's slowly opening trust, and the twins teaching her a hand game, and Henry's questions about the sky. She had stayed because the work was in front of her, and she was not a person who left things undone in front of her, and then she had stayed because she wanted to, which was a different thing, and a better one. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't look like bravery or boldness or the dramatic gesture. It looks like a woman picking up her smaller trunk and saying to a 16-year-old boy holding someone else's baby, "We might as well make the best of it." It looks like sitting on the floor outside a child's door in the dark. It looks like reading a contract twice and then asking the question nobody wanted to ask. It looks, from the outside, like stubbornness or practicality or the absence of better options. But it is courage. It is the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that shows up in the morning and again in the evening and again, when the fever breaks at 3 in the morning, and again when the letter from the lawyer says, "Not everything but enough." It is the most common kind of courage in the world and the least celebrated. And it is, Clara had come to believe, the only kind that actually builds anything worth keeping. She had come west looking for a life. She had found instead the harder and better thing, which was the work of making one. What? Noah turned 5 in April. He received a hat from Clara, sized imperfectly because she'd measured his head while he was asleep, which meant he'd moved at a critical moment, which meant the hat sat at a slight angle that he seemed to consider an improvement. He wore it to tell the horse something important on the afternoon of his birthday. Clara watched from the barn doorway, her arms folded against the spring cold, and listened to him making his case, whatever it was, delivered with his usual serious, detailed manner, one hand gesturing, the horse attending with professional patience. He had grown since October. All of them had. May was walking now, lurching across the cabin floor with the magnificent confidence of someone who hasn't yet internalized the possibility of falling. Henry had lost 2 teeth and gained approximately 40 new questions to fill the gap. The twins were 9, a fact they treated with new gravity, as if 8 had been provisional, but 9 was the real beginning of something. Emma had started teaching herself to read the almanac, which Clara had encouraged, and Elias had quietly ensured they had an updated copy of. And Caleb had gone to Rollins for his week with Fitch and come back different in a way that was hard to name precisely. Not older, exactly, but more certain of the direction he was heading, which was its own kind of growth. Noah finished his address to the horse. He turned and saw Clara in the doorway. He adjusted his hat, which had slipped during the gesturing portion, and walked toward her. "What were you telling him?" Clara asked. "That I'm 5 now," Noah said, "and that things are going to be different." Different how? He thought about this carefully, the way he thought about everything. "Better," he said, "just better." He walked past her into the barn to find the cat, and Clara stood in the doorway with the April wind coming off the mountains and the sound of the household around her. Elias in the far field, Caleb's voice somewhere near the fence line, Emma calling Henry's name from the cabin in the tone that meant he'd disappeared again. And she thought about a woman on a stage rattling west across the country, holding 31 letters, hoping. She had not gotten what she hoped for. She had gotten something that hope, at its best, is actually pointing toward not the specific thing you asked for, but the real thing underneath it. The thing underneath hope is almost always the same thing, to matter to someone. To be in a place where your presence makes a difference. To have your hands needed and your judgment trusted and your staying mean something to the people you stay for. Clara Whitfield had traveled 9 days across the country and knocked on a door expecting a husband. What opened was something she hadn't known she needed. A leaning cabin, 7 difficult, singular, imperfect children, a man who had been lying to himself as much as to her, and a valley full of problems that nobody was going to solve unless somebody decided to stay long enough to solve them. She had decided. And the valley, slowly, had become hers. Not because she'd fought for it, though she had. Not because she'd earned it, though she had. But because she had been present for it, for the apple butter and the bad contract and the fever nights, and the floor sitting and the puzzle pieces and the hat that didn't quite fit, and presence, sustained and unglamorous and entirely unspectacular, is what turns a place into a home and a collection of people into a family. She turned away from the doorway. May was calling from inside the cabin, that new purposeful calling of a child who has just realized she has a voice that can reach people in other rooms, which is one of the great discoveries of being almost one. Clara went to her. She always did.